Good morning, and thank you very much for your kind invitation. Actually, I have to apologize, first of all, because you have to endure my terrible German accent for quite a while. But I hope that's okay, and it's my first time in Liverpool. Actually, I'm from Hamburg. There's a lot of connections with Liverpool, the Beatles, and so on. So it's really a pleasure to be here. Yes, I'm a member of the European Parliament and the Economic Affairs Committee, which is not the primary committee dealing with TTIP, but we're dealing with parts of it, so financial regulation, for example. And when I got this invitation, I was quite surprised, because I thought, well, everybody in the UK is now discussing about Brexit, and these guys invite me for TTIP. But I think there is a connection indeed, because what people are concerned about with the European Union, in some regard, you would also find in TTIP creating a huge internal market and accepting the standards of the counterpart, while not always having kind of minimum standards in place, which then people perceive as a risk leading to a raise of the bottom. I think, my personal opinion, and that's enough then for Brexit, is that David Cameron wants to stay in for the wrong reasons, and the others wants to get out for the wrong reasons. But nevertheless, I think you have an interesting time right now. So on TTIP, first of all, we have to see that there are many similar agreements being prepared. There's also CETA with Canada, and there's also a trade and service agreement which is negotiated among 50 countries and all the EU member states, which is basically about services. It's called TISA, but most of the attention, at least in Germany, in my country, focused on TTIP, and there's also risk involved. Because now a lot of people say, well, TTIP might be dead. There has been a lot of public pressure, there have been leaks, and then some people say, well, if it's not hammered down until Obama has left the presidency, it might be dead. Nevertheless, I want to say that people should be aware that whatever happens to TTIP, CETA is on its way. And in CETA you would find many provisions that, from my point of view, are even more concerning than what is currently discussed in TTIP. And as a lot of US companies, European companies, have subsidiaries in Canada, they could use many of the instruments in CETA on there, but I will talk about that in a minute. First of all, what is TTIP about? Most people maybe think, well, few years ago, some people thought it's an infectious disease or something like that. Then some people thought, well, it's a trade agreement, free trade agreement. And I was recently in Cambridge, and I spoke to Ha-Joon Chang, a South Korean economist who works at Cambridge and who wrote some best-selling books about the history of free trade and so on. And he basically said to me, well, this is not a free trade agreement. But it's basically about investment partnership, granting corporations bigger power versus democracy. However, even if we talk about free trade, we have to be cautious, because here in the UK, when I was still an economics student, I had these standard textbooks where they would explain to me that the UK prospered in the 19th century because of free trade. And it's really worthwhile to check out the books of Ha-Joon Chang, because he goes at great lengths with a lot of sophistication to explain that this was actually not the case, but the UK was a highly protectionist country before they opened up the markets, and they were in a better position than other countries, and then gained from free trade. And a lot of things could be, similar things could be said about the United States, about Germany, and other highly industrialized countries. However, if you are interested in that kind of thing, you can go on Google and you can Google my name and Haijun Chang, and you will find the interview even in English with a very bad German accent, but I'm sure you will understand. So TTIP is basically about removing so-called non-tariff barriers, because the tariffs between the United States and the European Union are already pretty low. They are barely non-existent. There are still some in some sectors, but they don't play such a huge role. And these non-tariff barriers, a complicated word, means barriers to international trade or investment that have nothing to do with tariffs, hence non-tariff barriers. And this can be pretty much any government law or regulation or standard that is perceived by the perspective of investors as a barrier. And this may involve different things. Just to make a few examples, in Europe we have the so-called cautionary principle. I'm not sure whether that's the right translation in English, meaning that before, for example, you would admit a chemical substance or product on the market, you have to show that it's not harmful to the health of the public. In the United States, it's pretty much the other way around. So you have to prove that there's a risk involved. Hence, you would find, for example, in cosmetics, like chemical substances that are forbidden. I think in Europe, there are around 3,000 or something. I might be mistaken here, but it's a pretty large number. And I always play the guessing game, how many chemical substances in cosmetics are forbidden in the United States? Would anybody feel inclined to guess?
3, isn't it?
Well, 10, yeah, 10 is pretty close. 11.
11.
Yeah. And so here you can see that it has a huge impact. But this does not mean that you would always have the lower standards in the United States. If you think about financial market regulation, it's actually interesting, because I spoke a few months ago to the UK Commissioner Jonathan Hill, who's a former financial lobbyist from the City of London, now tasked with regulating the financial markets of the European Union. He very openly, he's a very open person, straightforward, and he told me that well, the United States demand more own capital for subsidiaries of foreign banks that operate in the United States. Why? Because they say, well, if we run into a new financial crisis and they run into trouble, we don't want to foot the bill. We don't want the US taxpayers to foot the bill, and since we don't supervise these banks, we want that they retain a little bit more own capital. And this is something that the European banks are heavily attacking. And they say, well, this is a discrimination, it's a non-tariff barrier. It extends to labor protection. For example, in Germany, I don't know so much about the UK, we have certain provisions that when a municipality has a public tender and some company wins the tender to build a building or whatsoever, they sometimes have the requirement to respect certain collective bargaining agreements, certain wage standards. And also these kind of things could be considered a barrier to trade, insofar as a US company could argue we don't have this requirement in our home market, so it's a discrimination if we face it here. Well, apart from these issues, what features very prominent in the whole debate about TTIP and CETA are the so-called arbitration courts or investor-state dispute settlement. Complicated word again. The basic story is that you would have investment courts where multinational corporations or potential investors could sue governments when they perceive they're being discriminated. The story about these courts, they are already anchored in many international agreements, and some countries have actually cancelled them. South Africa recently has cancelled investment partnership with the European Union. Australia has complained that they will never sign again a trade agreement which entails these investment courts. Why? Well, because you should not consider these courts being a standard court like you know them in the UK with the judge with the funny hair and grey hair, and then, I don't know, in Germany they speak an oath to the constitution and so on. But basically you would have three parties involved. So one lawyer for the state, one lawyer for the multinational corporation, and the neutral arbitrator. That was the old system, at least. And there you would very often find that a judge that, a lawyer that works for the oil industry can be tomorrow the neutral arbitrator. And if you allow me that language, they make a shitload of money out of these court cases because they have a very high turnover. And we know now of instances where investors were suing governments simply based on the fact that they claimed we were going to invest in your country. They haven't done so actually yet, but they claimed we're going to invest in your country, and now you changed your laws, your provisions, and this has hurt our legitimate interest in a reliable profit expectation. There's no doubt that you need some rule of law and stability, and that this is also important for investment decisions, but I don't see the point why between the European Union or the United States and even versus some developing countries, instead of building capacities for a better legal system, you would need these kind of privatized court systems. The problem is that in this old ISDS system, you would not even have a right to appeal. And it's a one-way street, only the corporation that can sue the government. Actually, the European Commission argues, well, but in a lot of cases, it was not the company that won the litigation process. That's true, but in the majority of cases, there was a so-called, we call it in Germany, Vergleich. I don't know the English term. It's when you settle, a settlement, yeah. You peacefully settle the whole issue, but usually the issue is settled because, for example, the state says, well, I will repeal that law. This is what happened in Hamburg, for example, where we had a big conflict about some energy production firm, and there were some risks perceived leading to poisoning of the water, the Elbe, which go through Hamburg. And well, they settled. Very often these judgments are not public. And in other cases, they settle because some money goes over the table. Hence, we are very concerned about these kind of things. In Australia, you have the example that they started to regulate tobacco advertisement. Some countries choose to have these pictures from the magazines of parody on the packages. Some states choose to have a more neutral packaging to forbid advertisement. And there, Philip Morris, via its subsidiary in Hong Kong, sued the Australian government. You would have even other examples, especially in developing countries, where they tried, for example, to reap the benefits of their own oil industry in Ecuador, to renegotiate certain terms with the investors, and even there they were sued. And lastly, we had a very prominent case of Argentina, where Argentina had a haircut in debt, and they were not able anymore to service the debt. And as in the private industry, when you go bankrupt, it's much more convenient that you would settle with the people you owe the money than just paying one person and not having any money left for the others. So there was a negotiation process, and prior to that, a kind of hedge fund from the United States bought Argentinian government bonds knowingly, because they knew they're going to be bankrupt soon. And when then Argentina made a settlement with all the investors, they said, well, we stay out of this. We will not accept the settlement. And they sued them for a kind of return on profit of over 1,250%. If you would talk to any baker or something, if you ever have return on investment like that, you would say, well, maybe you have to talk to the drug dealer here or somebody else. So basically, then, since these government bonds were issued according to US law, Argentina wanted to pay the installments for the investors, to the other investors who had agreed to the settlement, but the New York judge blocked the account and said, well, you cannot pay the others out, you first have to satisfy these holdout investors. And when Argentina refused, they even confiscated the marine ship of Argentina at the coast of Ghana. So all these kind of things happen, and you can really see there, the issue is not the money or anything. The issue is that democratically elected governments can be prevented from introducing laws or regulations to the benefit of the majority of the people because they have to be afraid of being sued. And in the US now you have a whole industry called litigation finance, where you would have smart law students working for big law firms that would, in the morning when they maybe still eat their egg, they would look like in a phone book into some laws and say, well, who can we sue today? And then they make a phone call and call that company without having an own economic interest in the case and saying, well, could we not finance that case for you? So it's a little bit like, you know, youngsters that are downloading illegally some music and then they get this letter, you breach our copyright right. It's something like that kind of system, but this time not about music, but against democracy. Thirdly, and lastly, because I might be already over time, a lot of this, a lot of the interest in these kind of agreements is in the service sector. Because pretty much in the European Union, 25% of GDP of the economic cake is produced via public tenders and public services. So it's a huge piece of the pie. And this is something where certainly private corporations want to get in. Well, there are many provisions that would, for example, say if a municipality, let's say, offers a service against a fee, so it's not for free, let's say using the bus or something else, or even theater productions, then this would be subject to these treaties because it's a commercial issue. And then we find, for example, just to make one example, that well, if you have certain subsidies, let's say for performance theaters or for local film industry, that the big champs from the industry could come and say, well, why do you grant these subsidies to them but not to us? So this is basically anti-competitive, which would then force a lot of municipalities to not engage in these kind of subsidies anymore. Lastly, where are we at with TTIP? I think that TTIP is a prime example of big democratic involvement, at least in my country, in Germany. A lot of people are really concerned about it. There was a huge demonstration with 250,000 people in Berlin, which for Germans is quite a big thing. Because there's the saying that before Germans go to demonstrate at a train station, they would buy a train ticket. So this was really a huge thing, and you saw that, for example, the Minister of Economics, Sigmar Gabriel from the Social Democratic Party, wrote a letter to the German people, printed in many newspapers. Basically, we funded it. We paid his letter, and he wrote a letter to us, telling us that, well, TTIP is not such a big problem. We will reform this investor-state dispute settlement, and actually there have been some reforms proposed. I don't have the time at length to explain why I still think it's problematic, and even the German Association of Judges said the same. But he wrote this letter, but he was very silent on CETA. Because in CETA we might have the same thing through the back doors. And in CETA you have a provision on certain services which is called the negative list, which means that everything which is not explicitly excluded and on that list would be subject to this agreement. And when I was campaigning for the elections in 2014 for the European Parliament, a lot of my colleagues from other parties told me, how can you be against TTIP or CETA? You don't know what's in there. You know, but the problem with CETA is not what's in there, but what's not in there. You know, so what is not explicitly mentioned is not excluded. And by the way, I certainly responded, how can you be for TTIP or CETA if you don't know what's in there? Because we have a lot of problem with transparency. This was also a big issue. So we have to go to reading rooms where, depending on the nature of the papers, we can sometimes not take notes. You come in a very small room where you have to leave your phone. You cannot talk openly about what you read there. What I usually do is then I write a written question to the Commission. Is it true that? And then they have to prove that I have it from the room. But the problem is that we have a lot of privileges in this European Parliament. I was a young, average lad that entered the European Parliament, and then you have all these kind of silly things like a separate entrance for the MEPs, being carried around these nice black limousines the whole day. But when it's about informing your citizens about what something which is really important, they really treat you sometimes like a little child. And this is why I want to appeal to you to engage the subject. It will have consequences, even for Liverpool, for municipalities. Be alerted. Follow the debates on CETA. The problem is that in the European Parliament we had a lot of resolutions with a lot of nice words in there, but TTIP or CETA should not be involved. But you must be aware that the European Parliament in the end can only say yes or no. And this is like a little bit like in the Mafia movie with Marlon Brando, where Marlon Brando comes and says, I make you an offer you can't refuse. You know, because then they say, well, we had these complicated negotiations and it's a give and take. I think that that we can still stop these kind of agreements. Also, there are already new ones in the pipeline with Mexico. Now they want to renegotiate because the Mexicans say, you Europeans and the United States, you do this kind of thing. We also would like to engage in a new deal. And when it will be decided that it's a so-called mixed agreement, meaning that it intervenes also in national prerogatives, which it does, according to my reading. The European Commission says no, even the German government says yes, then it must be voted in all 28 EU member states, 28 or 27, depending on your vote. And this is a good thing. Why are there so how can I say, are there so nice people sitting around the national parliaments that always defend your interests? No, certainly not. But the pressure on the national parliaments is much higher because people want to get re-elected. And in the European Parliament, it's like, you know, we make this or we make that, or we push a button, and then people say, well, maybe I'm concerned about these agreements, but I will not be, you know, nominated by my party again if I rebel too much, and then in 4 years' time people might have forgotten about it. Not all people can always buy a train ticket to demonstrate in Brussels. This is why we have to fight for a mixed agreement, and then the chance is very high that we might stop it in 1 or 2 member states, and then the whole project is dead. This is why the Council now wants to make a preliminary application of CETA even before national parliaments have voted. So stay alerted. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to this discussion.
For the excellent opening speech. So we are a bit pushed with time to move to the first panel, but we still have time for a couple of quick questions if there are any more questions from the audience. We need the microphone.
Well, I've got a booming voice. It usually elicits complaints in restaurants, but for this occasion it's quite. So thank you very much, Mr. De Masi, for your intervention. I wanted to pick up on the last point you made about it being a mixed agreement. Now I can't see, given the political momentum, how it can't be a mixed agreement. So my question then is that there are still some ambiguities in how the treaty is interpreted, right? Because of course with the EU-Korea agreement, which was also a mixed agreement, the procedure was that the Commission basically would seek the approval of the European Parliament and only subsequently provisionally apply the agreement. Right? So, you can even provisionally apply before the European Parliament has voted on it, but I think the Commission has said that this is sort of the precedent for the future. My question is, depending on, of course, the ECJ judgment, or advisory opinion, I should say, on the Singapore investment agreement, which will be a determination on what is covered by EU competence on foreign direct investment. I mean, how do you see the process unfolding? Because in theory, what you could have is, yes, it's a mixed agreement, but we will provisionally apply almost all of it anyway. And in the Korea agreement, in fact, almost all of it, apart from the cultural protocol, which the individual member states were signing themselves, was provisionally applied before ratification by member state parliament. So my question is that not an option? Is that not a possibility of being provisionally applied?
You're right. I think that there's the legal side of it and there's the political side of it. Well, Singapore and Korea, the public did not care much about these agreements. Wrongly so, maybe, but there was not so much public attention. So I think, yes, these ECJ advisory opinion will play a huge role, because if the ECJ arrives at a conclusion that all is fine and you can do this, you can prolong this provisional application, or you can have this provisional application placed for a long time, then certainly the Commission would be very keen to pursue that kind of method, not to expose this agreement to parliamentary debate, and then maybe in 3-4 years they say, well, now it's already in place, we have made so many preparations, we cannot pull out. And the pressure even in national parliaments would be very high if then people said we don't want that agreement, but it's already provisionally applied, and you say, well, you're disturbing transatlantic relations, and it would be a diplomatic nightmare, and then maybe even some critical MPs would not vote anymore against it. That's the risk, that's the legal side of it. And I think that the ECJ is very inclined usually to grant more competences to European institutions and even the Commission. So they would not generally be in favor of prerogatives of the national parliaments. And that's a huge risk involved. On the other hand, I think that the tension is so high, and there's so many big political stakes that even the Commission cannot completely ignore that. They are determined now, in the Council, to make this provisional application, but I think then the second round has started for us to really protest, and we are currently now collecting a lot of signatures from various political groups in national parliaments to say it is the right of national parliaments to decide upon this. And I also know that in the Netherlands they have preparations for a referendum, national referendum. So I think that this is true, that we expect this kind of provisional application, but my political group in Germany, for example, is preparing a lawsuit against the German Constitutional Court. So it might get very interesting if the ECJ says, well, we can have this provisional application for undetermined period of time, because then the question is, what is provisional application? 1 year, is it 5 years, is it 10 years? That is yet not well defined. But the German Constitutional Court might say, well, no, we defend the prerogative of the German Parliament, and then you really get an institutional conflict, which is always interesting. And the German government, by the way, also insists that the German Parliament votes. Why? Not because they want to stop TTIP or CETA or anything, but because certainly the member states want to reserve their own bargaining power in future negotiations with this Commission.
Any other questions?
Are most of the German population aware of it? Because I think most of the British population are totally unaware. Our main parties don't even mention it. And it seems such a huge thing that it's being done behind our backs, and and the media don't talk about it much. Is it different in Germany? Is there more awareness than there is in Britain, would you say?
I don't know enough about the debate in Britain to judge, but my impression, what I hear from colleagues, is that in Germany and France, it is pretty much the biggest political subject, not the biggest political subject, but the member states where it plays the largest role in the public debate. UK always had a very transatlantic tradition of trade integration and so on, so maybe there's a different political culture also attached. However, what is very schizophrenic for me as a German is that a lot of people in Germany rally rightfully against this agreement. But for example, when I speak to people in Greece, they would tell me, well, people are not so concerned anymore here about TTIP because everything is already, dysfunctional, privatized, and so on. And there, Germany played a huge role, and there was not much critical debate within Germany about this. So it's pretty much, maybe in Germany there's a huge tradition of consumer protection. It's perceived as a big issue even in the middle classes. So this is maybe why a critical mass amassed there, and you also have involvement of certain NGOs which were really focusing on that issue. And we can, until today, we cannot really explain why, because it's such a complicated subject. And it basically was ignored even by the parties for a long time, even by the media, even my own party. I pressured my own party to make a campaign during the European elections in TTIP, and I said, well, people don't know what this is. It became this huge topic, and people really complained in the online media that media would not cover the subject. And after a while, they could not ignore it anymore. So my advice to the British people is, if you push hard enough for the subject, even the British yellow press has to do it.
Maybe one final question.
Okay.
Because we are very pressed on time.
Firstly, thanks for what you said. It's really enlightening. My question is regarding social justice. Because in the last Parliament, what was being pushed through was the rehabilitation revolution, which is what I like to call privatisation light. It's a mutualisation agenda. So there's already private sector bodies involved in rehabilitation of criminals. So, apologies, I've just written down a couple of notes. As the rehabilitation revolution is happening currently, do you think it's theoretically possible, should TTIP happen, that corporations could sue government if crime goes down, and that would de-incentivise governments to actually stop crime happening?
Well, I don't think that this would be subject to investor-state dispute settlement. Maybe a subject would be whether you run private prisons or public prisons or something like that, depending on the agreement. But what I would like to say is that the logic of TTIP is very much already enshrined in the EU treaties. The difference is that you have to accept the standards of the counterparts. For example, if, let's say, a Polish worker comes to Germany, he would not in any case always be paid the wage that is common in the German construction side, but according to the principle to the country of origin. So and there are certain provisions against it, but it's very hard to control. And so this has led basically to a lot of people being afraid, for example, about wage competition. We need a country of destination principle in Europe, meaning that if I have higher productivity in Germany, Polish worker is very welcome to work on the German construction site, but he should be protected by the same wage level, so not to have a spat between the German and the Polish workers, for example. And so this system of applying the standards of the trading partner, but thereby having a race to the bottom, because you have a competitive advantage if you apply the lower standard. Also, you can extend to courts. I mean, we have a harmonization of the court system in Europe where you would sometimes have to, there's a debate now whether you would have to apply court judgments that were maybe not ruled down in some Eastern European countries to the standards that we would like to see in some other European countries, because they had not basic right to defense, and so on. And so I think that a lot of what concerns us in TTIP is part and parcel of the European Union, and maybe part and parcel why so many people are feeling increasingly uncomfortable with the European Union. Now the difference is that we want to extend it to an even larger market. And when so many people rally against or are uncomfortable with a positive idea like European integration, then we should maybe think about whether we really want to pursue that path or whether it's not a way to disintegrate.